What happened to people when they grew too old to work, too frail to farm, or too ill to beg in the shadowy streets of medieval Europe from around 1000 to 1500 CE? Did anyone care for them? What terrible fates awaited those without family or fortune when the cold winds of age blew through their threadbare lives? Number 7. The village elder, displaced and forgotten. Alara had seen 100 winters, or so it seemed, in the small, muddy village nestled beside the river. Her hands, gnarled and thick with a lifetime of tilling the hard earth, no longer possessed the strength to guide the wooden plow. Her back, bent like a gnarled oak, ached with a relentless fire, a constant reminder of decades spent stooping over furrows, planting seeds, and harvesting meager crops. She had been a strong woman once, vital to the rhythm of the village, her knowledge of herbs and the ways of the land respected, her advice sometimes sought. But time, that relentless reaper, had taken its toll, leaving her with failing sight and a cough that rattled her bones through the long, damp nights. The cottage Alara lived in, a simple structure of wattle and daub, had been her family's for generations. It was holding a strip of land granted by the lord of the manor in exchange for labor, for service, for a portion of the harvest. For most of her life, Alara had been the very engine of that agreement, her toil providing for her family and the lord's coffers. But the system, rigid and unforgiving, had little room for the unproductive. Manorial records, carefully kept by scribes and stewards, meticulously noted the obligations of each tenant. They listed the days of work, owed the rents due, the services required. They rarely, if ever, made allowances for the infirmity of age. A peasant's worth was measured by their ability to work the land, to contribute to the agricultural output that sustained the entire feudal hierarchy. Alara's son, Thomas, burdened by his own young family and the relentless pressure to provide, found himself in an impossible bind. The holding, barely sufficient for one strong man and his family to work, became a crushing weight with an aging mother who could no longer contribute. The lord's reeve, his eyes as cold as the winter river, demanded the customary labor service, the plowing, the harrowing, the harvesting, with no sympathy for the weakness of the elderly. Records of manorial courts show countless disputes over broken agreements, over failed obligations. These courts, presided over by the lord's representative, rarely sided with the struggling peasant against the established demands of the estate. The idea of retirement, as we understand it today, simply did not exist for people like Alara. There were no pensions, no state support, no social safety nets. A peasant's life was a continuous cycle of labor until death intervened. If one could not work, one became a burden, a mouth to feed, without contributing to the common larder. Sometimes, in rare cases, a lord might grant a small korodi, a charitable allowance of food or lodging, to a long-serving, loyal worker or their widow. These were not rights, however, but acts of grace, recorded in specific charters or wills, and usually reserved for former servants of the lord's household rather than the common field worker. Most peasants had no such luxury. Alara's family tried. Thomas's wife, Agnes, herself worn down by childbearing and endless chores, shared her meager bread with Alara, but the strain was visible in her tired eyes. The children, thin and perpetually hungry, watched their grandmother with a mixture of fear and confusion. Famines, a constant threat in medieval Europe, made such situations even more dire. Chroniclers of the period, like Ralph of Cobshall, often recounted the devastating effects of crop failures and subsequent starvation, highlighting how the old and the very young were always the first to succumb. Even in good years, food was scarce, and a non-contributing member could push a family from bare subsistence into outright destitution. The village itself, a tight-knit community, had its own unspoken rules. Charity was primarily directed through the church, often in the form of alms distributed at the church door or small bequests left in wills for the benefit of the poor. These donations, while well-intentioned, were often insufficient to meet the overwhelming need. Moreover, they were often distributed without distinction, a single loaf of bread among dozens of hungry mouths. The village priest, burdened by his own duties and often as poor as his flock, could offer little beyond spiritual comfort. Accounts from monastic cartularies sometimes mention grants to the poor, but these were typically for specific limited purposes, not a broad support system for all elderly. Alara began to spend her days outside the cottage, huddled against the wall, watching the activity of the village pass her by. Her presence, once a symbol of continuity, slowly became a source of quiet discomfort. She embodied the fear that gripped every family. What happens when strength fails? What happens when the hands that fed us can no longer feed themselves? Medieval medical treatises, rudimentary as they were, recognized the decline of old age, but offered no solutions for the economic hardship it brought. They detailed humors and ailments, not social welfare. One bitter autumn, the reeve, inspecting the holdings, noticed the neglected state of Alara's strip. Thomas, working doubly hard still, could not keep up with the demands. The reeve, perhaps under pressure from the Lord to increase output, or perhaps merely enforcing the letter of the law, decided the holding was no longer being adequately worked. A new, younger family, eager for land, was available. Such evictions, though not everyday occurrences, were not unheard of, particularly when lords sought to consolidate land or replace inefficient tenants. Records of court rolls from manors across England and France show instances where tenants were removed for failing to meet their obligations. Alara was told, not unkindly but firmly, that she and Thomas's family must leave the small cottage. Thomas and Agnes could seek work as landless laborers, perhaps, or migrate to a town, a journey fraught with its own dangers and uncertainties. For Alara, the prospect was a death sentence. To be without a hearth, without a roof, in the biting cold of an approaching winter, meant exposure, hunger, and a swift end. She held onto her son's arm, her old eyes wide with a silent plea. There was no appeal, no higher court for a peasant in such a situation. The feudal system was a pyramid of obligations and rights, and at the very bottom, rights were few. The day came when the new family, young and vigorous, arrived with their few possessions. Alara watched from the doorway as her meager belongings were carried out. A rough woolen blanket, a small wooden bowl, a broken spinning wheel. Her memories, her entire life, were tied to this patch of earth, this small dwelling. As the cold air bit at her exposed skin, she realized that her century of toil, her lifetime of contribution, had simply run its course. She was an extraneous cog in a machine that had no use for broken parts. The paths leading from the village were muddy and cold, offering no warmth, no welcome, to an old woman with nothing but her worn bones and a lifetime of hard labor behind her. Number 6. The widowed weaver. Alone in the city, Isolde had lived her entire life within the crooked, crowded lanes of Norwich, a bustling city in medieval England known for its vibrant wool trade. Her fingers, though now stiff with age and the beginnings of arthritis, once danced across the loom, weaving fine woolen cloth with a speed and skill that few could match. For decades, she and her husband John had been a formidable team. He had prepared the raw wool, cleaned and carded it, while she had spun the yarn and then, with deft precision, woven it into bolts of fabric destined for market, bringing a steady, if modest, income into their cramped two-room house. Their livelihood was intrinsically linked to the guilds, the powerful organizations that controlled trades in medieval towns, regulating quality, prices, and access to the craft. Guild ordinances preserved in municipal archives detailed strict rules for apprenticeship, mastership, and the conduct of business, but offered little in the way of safety nets for those who could no longer work. When John died suddenly from a fever that swept through the city, Isolde's world crumbled. He had been her partner, her provider, and her strength. Now she was alone, a widow in a city that had little pity for the unproductive. The loom, which had once hummed with the rhythm of their life, now stood silent and imposing in the corner of their home, a monument to her lost livelihood. Her eyes, once sharp enough to spot the slightest flaw in a thread, now blurred easily, making the intricate work of weaving impossible. The pain in her joints made it agony to sit for long hours, let alone operate the heavy pedals of the loom. In medieval society, women, especially those of the working classes, often derived their economic standing and social protection through their husbands. A married woman might engage in various trades, sometimes independently, but more often as part of a family enterprise. Single women or widows faced significant challenges. Legal documents of the time, such as wills and dowry agreements, often reveal how women's property rights and economic independence were limited or precarious, especially after widowhood. Without a husband, a woman's ability to conduct business, to hold property, or to simply earn a living was severely curtailed. Isolde tried to continue her trade, but the quality of her work declined. The guild, ever vigilant about maintaining standards and protecting its members' reputations, received complaints. Guild masters, rigid in their adherence to the rules, sent word that her output was no longer acceptable. To be expelled or sidelined by the guild meant an immediate end to her legitimate earnings. Records of guild minutes sometimes show fines or warnings issued to members who failed to uphold standards, but never provisions for those who simply became too old or infirm to do so. The guild's focus was on the craft, not on individual welfare. Outside of occasional charitable bequests to their own destitute members, which were rare and limited, her small house, though owned by her and John, was mortgaged, a common practice for obtaining capital in medieval towns. Without John's regular income, making the payments became impossible. Moneylenders, often Jewish merchants or wealthy Christian landowners, were notoriously unforgiving. Records of town courts frequently detail cases of debt and foreclosure, with little leniency shown to those who fell behind. Isolde faced the very real threat of losing her home, the only remaining link to her past life, and a roof over her head. The church, often the primary source of organized charity, offered some solace, but little practical support for daily living. Alms were distributed at church doors, often a few coins or a piece of bread. But these were meant for the truly destitute, the beggars, not for a respectable widow who had simply lost her means. Parish registers sometimes noted charitable donations, but these were rarely enough to sustain someone. Monasteries and convents sometimes offered places for the poor, but these were often reserved for those who had connections, or who committed to a life of service which Isolde, in her physical decline, could not. Moreover, space was always extremely limited. Her children, if she had any, would have been her only hope for support. But Isolde had no surviving children. Infancy and childhood mortality rates were appallingly high in medieval times, a stark reality revealed in demographic studies based on parish records and burial grounds. Many families had no surviving adult children to care for their elderly parents, or their children were themselves too poor to offer meaningful assistance. The idealized image of a large supportive family did not always align with the harsh realities of life. Isolde began to sell off her few remaining possessions: a small brass lamp, a worn but beloved spinning wheel, a few pieces of pottery. Each sale chipped away not just at her material wealth, but at her sense of self, her dignity. Sumptuary laws, while primarily aimed at regulating the dress and spending of the wealthy, sometimes implicitly, reflected the importance of material possessions in defining social status. To be stripped of one's possessions was to be stripped of one's place in society. The cold seeped into her bones. Without the warmth of a proper fire, without sufficient food, Isolde grew weaker. Her neighbors, busy with their own struggles, offered occasional kindness, a bowl of stew, a sympathetic word, but they could not take on the burden of her full care. Their own lives were a precarious balancing act between earning enough to eat and avoiding debt. The urban poor, in particular, lived on the knife edge of survival, as evidenced by chroniclers like William Fitzstephen, who described the crowded and often harsh conditions of London in the 12th century. One day the knock came at her door. It was the money-lender's agent, accompanied by a town official. The house was to be repossessed. Isolde stood in the doorway of her home, the place where she had spent a lifetime of labor, of love, of quiet triumphs. The street was noisy with the cries of merchants, the clatter of carts, the endless rush of medieval urban life. But for Isolde, the sounds faded into a distant hum. She was being cast out, a human thread severed from the vibrant, indifferent tapestry of the city. Her skill, her knowledge, her lifetime of contribution now counted for nothing. She had no destination, no plan, just the knowledge that outside the confines of her small, familiar home, the city was a vast, cold, and utterly indifferent place for an old woman who could no longer weave. Number 5. The Master Mason, broken by age. Pierre, a master mason, had spent 60 years shaping stone, first as an apprentice, then as a journeyman, and finally as a master carving intricate patterns and laying massive blocks for cathedrals that soared towards the heavens. His calloused hands, once powerful enough to wield a mallet and chisel all day, now trembled. His eyes, once keen enough to read the subtle grains of granite, were clouded by cataracts. The ringing in his ears, a constant companion from a lifetime of hammering stone, had finally begun to dull his hearing. He had helped build the south transept of the Grand Cathedral in Chartres, a structure that would endure for centuries, a testament to the skill and devotion of men like him. But the very labor that immortalized stone had slowly, inexorably ground down his own flesh and bone. Master masons, as evidenced in building contracts and wage records from major construction projects like those at Westminster Abbey or Notre Dame, were highly skilled, well-respected members of medieval society. They earned good wages compared to common laborers and often held positions of authority on building sites. They were professionals, often part of fraternities or guilds of stonemasons that protected their craft and its secrets. However, even for these highly skilled artisans, there was no formalized retirement or disability insurance. A mason's income depended entirely on their ability to perform demanding physical labor. Pierre had planned as best he could for his old age. He had saved a portion of his earnings, keeping it in a strongbox hidden beneath his floorboards. He owned a small, sturdy house on the edge of the town. Not grand, but comfortable. He had no wife, no children, having dedicated his life almost entirely to his craft, to the silent, magnificent language of stone. His solace had been his work, the creation of beauty and endurance. He had assumed his savings, accumulated over decades of careful living, would see him through, but medieval economies were notoriously unstable. Periods of inflation, widespread famine, and the devastating impact of the Black Death and subsequent plagues could quickly erode savings. Price lists from medieval markets and chronicles often detailed dramatic fluctuations in the cost of basic goods. A series of bad harvests drove up the price of grain and bread, eating into Pierre's carefully hoarded coins. Then a new pestilence, not as catastrophic as the Great Death, but still deadly, swept through the region, delaying construction projects and reducing the demand for masons. Wage records from various building accounts show how work could be intermittent, dependent on the availability of funds from patrons, be they bishops, kings, or wealthy towns, and the general economic health of the region. Without steady work, Pierre's small savings dwindled faster than he could have imagined. His hands, too unsteady for fine carving, too weak for heavy lifting, were useless for earning. He tried to find lighter work, sharpening tools perhaps, or supervising younger apprentices. But the younger masons, ambitious and strong, were wary of a master who could no longer perform the physical demands of the trade. The hierarchy of a medieval building site, as depicted in illustrations from illuminated manuscripts showing masons at work, was clear. Strength and skill were paramount. Old age was often seen as a diminishing rather than an enhancing factor. Apprentice roles and guild regulations show the clear progression from novice to master, but rarely mention what happened when a master could no longer master. Pierre's house, his one true asset beyond his skill, became a burden. Taxes were due to the town council, records of which are often found in civic account books. Maintenance, too, was a constant need in a medieval house. Roofs leaked, walls cracked, hearths needed repair. He could not afford the materials or the labor. Slowly, the house began to fall into disrepair, mirroring the decay of his own body. He rarely left it now, the cold and damp creeping into his bones, exacerbating his pains. He considered entering an almshouse, a charitable institution usually founded by wealthy patrons or guilds to care for the poor and infirm. But space in these institutions was extremely limited and often reserved for those who had been benefactors themselves or who had powerful connections. The rules of these institutions, detailed in their founding charters, often stipulated strict moral conduct and physical requirements, sometimes excluding those who were too ill or too old to contribute even minimally. Furthermore, many almshouses were established only for specific trades or specific groups of people, not for all who were poor. A master mason might be considered too respectable or even too proud to enter such a place, especially if his decline was recent. His former colleagues, the younger masons he had taught, occasionally brought him a piece of bread or some cheese, but they were busy with their own lives, their own families, their own struggles to survive in a challenging world. The sense of community was strong in medieval towns, but it had its limits when faced with sustained personal destitution. The medieval concept of charity, as described in theological texts and evidenced by the charitable clauses in wills, was often an individual act of piety aimed at securing salvation rather than a systematic approach to social welfare. Pierre began to feel like a ghost in his own home, surrounded by the echoes of his past work. He would sit by the cold hearth tracing the lines of his aged hands, seeing in them the power that once shaped stone, now reduced to trembling weakness. He knew the great cathedrals he had built would stand for centuries, a monument to faith and human ingenuity. But he, the man who had helped raise them, would soon be gone, leaving no mark of his own, no enduring comfort for his old age. The irony was bitter. His legacy was imperishable, but his own life was fragile, crumbling. As winter approached, the cold pierced through the thin walls of his unheated house. Pierre often dreamt of the warm quarries, the sharp smell of freshly cut stone, the camaraderie of the masons, the clang of the mallet against the chisel, the rhythmic sound of creation. Now only the silence filled his days, broken only by the occasional creak of his decaying house or the sound of his own ragged breath. He had built beauty for the world, but for himself, in his final days, he had built only a solitary, cold waiting place. His lifetime of monumental effort had culminated not in peace, but in a profound, bone-chilling solitude. Number 4. The elder in the crumbling almshouse. Agnes had found a sliver of hope, or so she thought, when she secured a place in the almshouse of St. John the Baptist on the outskirts of Canterbury. For an old woman who had lost her husband, her small farm to a grasping lord, and her only child to the plague, it seemed like a refuge. She had heard tales of other almshouses, some well kept and benevolent, others little more than glorified poorhouses. This one, founded centuries ago by a pious merchant, promised shelter, daily bread, and spiritual comfort for a handful of elderly and infirm women. Its charter, meticulously recorded on parchment and kept in the archives, detailed the founder's noble intentions and the provisions for its residents. But good intentions, over time, often fray, and resources dwindle when Agnes arrived. The reality was stark. The stone walls, once sturdy, were damp with neglect. The roof, though patched in places, leaked during heavy rains, creating puddles on the cold flagstone floor of the common hall. The dormitory, a single large room with rows of narrow beds, was perpetually chilly, and the straw mattresses were thin and lumpy. The promised daily bread was often stale, and the thin gruel served twice a day offered little sustenance. The charitable bequests that were supposed to sustain the almshouse, listed in ancient wills and property deeds, had over generations been mismanaged, stolen, or simply insufficient to keep pace with rising costs and the ever-present need. Records of visitations to medieval hospitals and almshouses often reveal concerns about declining standards and insufficient funds. The master of the almshouse, a weary priest named Father Thomas, was burdened by the impossible task of managing meager resources. He himself was often ill-fed and poorly clothed. The staff consisted of a few younger women, not necessarily dedicated to the residents, but seeking whatever small shelter and food the almshouse could provide for themselves. Their kindness was often stretched thin by their own hardships and the constant demands of the residents. Medieval account books for charitable institutions show the constant struggle to balance income with the needs of the residents, often revealing a deficit. Agnes, with her aching joints and failing sight, found little comfort. The other residents, a collection of women equally broken by life, often quarreled over scraps of bread, a warm spot by the hearth, or a clean piece of cloth. Their shared misery did not breed camaraderie, but often resentment. The rules of the almshouse were strict and unforgiving. Residents were expected to attend daily prayers, to keep silent during certain hours, and to perform what small chores they could, such as mending clothes or sweeping the floors. Those who were too frail to contribute, like Agnes, became even more dependent, and sometimes targets of the frustration of those who could still manage. Rules of monastic orders and charitable institutions, found in their original charters, often emphasized obedience and communal living, sometimes overlooking the individual needs of the very old and infirm. The small private garden, once a source of fresh herbs and a quiet refuge, was overgrown and untended. The promised daily fire was often reduced to a few glowing embers, unable to warm the large, drafty hall. Illness spread easily in the crowded, unhygienic conditions. Coughs rattled through the dormitory at night, and fevers were a constant threat. Medieval medical knowledge, though improving, was still rudimentary, and the care provided in such institutions was basic at best. Death was a frequent visitor, its presence a chilling reminder to the remaining residents. Burial records from medieval hospitals and almshouses often show high mortality rates among the elderly residents. Agnes longed for the simple warmth of her own small cottage, for the familiar comfort of her own bed. She missed the taste of fresh milk and home-baked bread, things the almshouse could not provide. Her days were a monotonous cycle of prayer, hunger, and cold. She spent much of her time sitting by the window, watching the unchanging view of the muddy lane, listening to the ceaseless wind rattling the broken shutters. She thought of her lost life, of the vibrant world she had once inhabited, and felt a profound sense of abandonment. The funding for the almshouse, originally robust, had been vulnerable to the whims of politics and changing religious climates. The dissolution of some monasteries, or shifts in wealth, distribution among the nobility, could dramatically affect the endowments of such institutions. While this particular almshouse might not have been a direct victim of the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII, the general principle holds true. The long-term viability of medieval charitable foundations was always precarious. Without continuous, dedicated oversight and renewed funding, many slowly decayed, leaving their residents in a state of even greater precarity. One cold afternoon, a new resident arrived. She was younger than Agnes, perhaps in her late 50s, but clearly suffering from a debilitating illness. She brought with her stories of another almshouse, one that had completely closed its doors due to lack of funds, casting all its residents onto the streets. The news spread like a chill through the dormitory. The fear, a constant undercurrent, solidified into a terrifying possibility. What if this refuge, imperfect as it was, also ceased to exist? Where would they go then? The records of many medieval towns contain pleas for the poor, or edicts attempting to control begging, which suggests that the problem of homelessness and destitution was ever present. Agnes felt a profound sense of entrapment. She had exchanged the harsh uncertainty of the outside world for the decaying certainty of the almshouse. She was sheltered, yes, but also forgotten, living out her final years in a state of quiet desperation, a testament to the fragility of even the most well-intentioned medieval social safety nets. She was a silent witness to the slow, agonizing decline of a charitable endeavor left to crumble alongside the very stones of the building that was meant to protect her. Her hope, once a fragile spark, was slowly extinguished by the damp, the hunger, and the cold indifference of a world that had forgotten its promises. Number 3. The stranded pilgrim. Far from home. Brother Alaric had lived a life of quiet devotion within the stone walls of his Benedictine monastery in rural France. For most of his 70 years, his days had been ordered by the chiming of bells, the chanting of psalms, and the slow, rhythmic toil of copying manuscripts. He was a scholar, his mind sharp, his hands skilled with quill and ink. But a profound spiritual longing had seized him in his old age, a desire to visit the tomb of St. James at Santiago de Compostela, a pilgrimage of immense spiritual significance for many in medieval Europe. Pilgrimage accounts such as those found in guidebooks like the Liber Sancti Jacobi describe the arduous journeys undertaken by thousands. His abbot, recognizing Alaric's piety and long service, granted him permission, providing a small purse of coins and a letter of introduction to other monastic houses along the long road through France and Spain. The journey, however, was far more arduous than Alaric had anticipated. The roads were rough, little more than muddy tracks, often infested with bandits. The weather was unpredictable, alternating between blistering sun and drenching rain. His old legs, accustomed to the gentle pace of the cloister, ached with every step. The small purse of coins, intended to cover his modest needs, dwindled rapidly. Medieval pilgrims, unless very wealthy, often relied on the hospitality of monasteries, hospitals, and private individuals along the route. Records of these stopping places, sometimes found in monastic cartularies or local archives, indicate varying levels of hospitality, but none could accommodate every single pilgrim. As he neared the foothills of the Pyrenees, a cough he had tried to ignore grew worse, turning into a racking fever. He collapsed by the roadside, barely conscious, his body burning, his mind clouded. He was found by a passing merchant who, out of Christian charity, took him to a small hospitium, a pilgrim's hostel, in a remote village. These hostels, often attached to monasteries or maintained by charitable foundations, offered basic shelter and care for travelers, particularly pilgrims. Their resources, however, were always limited. In the hospitium, Alaric lay on a straw pallet, surrounded by other sick and weary travelers. The care was minimal. A few sips of water, a rough blanket, and the occasional visit from the village priest, who offered prayers but little in the way of effective medical treatment. Medieval medical practices, often based on humoral theory, had little to offer against virulent fevers. Accounts from medieval hospitals, such as those of the Hôtel Dieu in Paris, show that while they offered care, their primary function was often spiritual comfort and segregation of the sick, rather than advanced medical treatment. Days turned into weeks. The fever slowly receded, but left Alaric weakened, his legs barely able to support him. He was a burden on the hospitium, which had no long-term provisions for the chronically ill or the elderly. The abbot's letter, once his passport, was now a useless piece of parchment, for he was too far from his own monastery to expect their help, and too ill to continue his journey. His coins were gone, spent on the basic provisions of the hospitium. He was a stranger in a strange land, utterly dependent on the kindness of strangers, whose own resources were stretched thin. The hospitium master, a gruff but not unkind man, explained that Alaric could not stay indefinitely. The space was needed for new incoming pilgrims. Alaric had two choices: attempt the journey back, a seemingly impossible feat for his frail body, or remain in the village, relying entirely on the charity of the local villagers. The village itself was poor, its inhabitants struggling to eke out a living from the rocky soil. They had little to spare for an elderly, unproductive stranger. Records of local poor relief, where they existed, were generally focused on local residents, not transient pilgrims. Alaric, once a man of learning and quiet dignity, found himself reduced to begging for scraps at the village church door, his monastic habit. Once a symbol of respect, now a tattered reminder of a life he could no longer lead. He would sit, head bowed, his old eyes fixed on the muddy ground, listening to the harsh, unfamiliar dialect of the villagers. He, who had illuminated sacred texts with exquisite detail, now struggled to understand the simplest conversations. The spiritual journey he had undertaken had led him to a place of utter material destitution, a place where his intellect and piety counted for nothing against the stark reality of hunger and exposure. He thought of his monastery, its quiet cloister, the warmth of the scriptorium, the regular meals, the comforting rhythm of monastic life. He had traded that security for a spiritual quest, and now found himself adrift, cast out by the very system of hospitality he had relied upon. The road to Santiago, which for so many was a path to spiritual enlightenment, had become for Alaric a road to physical and spiritual desolation. He was a living testament to the dangers of medieval travel for the elderly and the precariousness of life for anyone without a fixed place in society. Winter approached, and the air grew sharp with cold. Alaric huddled in the drafty porch of the church, his thin habit offering little protection. The villagers, their hearts hardened by their own struggles, offered less and less. He was no longer the exotic, learned monk, but simply another mouth to feed, another burden on a community that had nothing to spare. He had sought salvation, but found himself in a purgatory of poverty and loneliness, miles from home, his body failing, his spirit tested beyond endurance. The journey which was meant to bring him closer to God had stripped him of everything that once defined him, leaving him as nothing but a frail, forgotten old man on the wrong side of a remote mountain pass. Number 2. The old woman, accused of witchcraft, shunned by her neighbors. Mabel had always been a solitary figure in her small, isolated hamlet, nestled deep within the English fenlands. She lived alone in a tiny, dilapidated cottage on the edge of the common land. Her only companions, a half-wild cat and the whispering reeds. Her face, etched with countless wrinkles, was often obscured by a heavy shawl, and her eyes, though still sharp, seemed to hold a world of unspoken knowledge. She gathered herbs from the marshes, brewed remedies for common ailments, and occasionally predicted the weather with uncanny accuracy. For decades, her reclusive nature and ancient wisdom were tolerated, even subtly respected. But as Mabel grew older, her infirmity became more pronounced. Her once steady hands began to tremble, and her memory sometimes failed her. And then, the whispers began. In medieval communities, particularly in rural areas, old women living alone, especially those who practiced traditional healing or were perceived as unusual, were often viewed with a mixture of fear and suspicion. When misfortune struck a village, a crop failure, a sudden illness among livestock, a child's inexplicable fever, the elderly, isolated woman often became an easy scapegoat. There were no systematic witch hunts of the scale seen in later centuries, but local accusations and community suspicion were very real. Records from manorial courts or local ecclesiastical courts sometimes show cases of slander or accusations of maleficium. Though often these did not escalate to formal witchcraft trials, Mabel had always been poor. But as her body weakened, she could no longer tend her tiny garden plot with the same diligence, nor could she walk the long miles to the nearest market town to sell her herbal concoctions. Her income, always meager, dwindled to nothing. She relied increasingly on the occasional kindness of neighbors. A bowl of milk here, a piece of bread there. But as she became more reliant, her presence became more of a burden, her poverty a constant reminder of the community's own precarious existence. People already struggling resented another mouth to feed, especially one that seemed to offer less and less in return. One brutal winter, a sickness swept through the hamlet, particularly affecting the children. Several succumbed to fear, raw and primal, gripped the villagers. They needed an explanation, a target for their anguish. A cow fell ill, its milk curdling. A young woman suffered a miscarriage. The whispers turned to murmurs, and the murmurs to open accusations. "It's Mabel," someone whispered. "She has an evil eye. Her remedies are curses in disguise. She withered the crops with her gaze." These accusations, fueled by superstition and desperation, quickly escalated. Popular beliefs about magic and curses were widespread, as evidenced in folklore collections and anecdotal reports from various medieval texts. Mabel, frail and hard of hearing, barely understood what was happening. Her former acquaintances, once accepting of her quiet eccentricities, now averted their eyes, clutching their children closer when she passed. Stones were thrown at her cottage. Her cat, her only companion, was found dead, its neck broken. The fear of witchcraft, often linked to the devil, was a powerful social force, as detailed in theological writings and later in witch trial documents. The Church, while primarily concerned with heresy, often inadvertently fueled these fears by condemning practices it deemed superstitious. No formal charges were laid against Mabel, but the community itself became her jailer and tormentor. No one would trade with her. No one would speak to her. The pathways to her cottage, once occasionally trodden by those seeking remedies, became overgrown. She was starved, not by explicit decree but by ostracism. Her well, her only source of clean water, was fouled. Her small patch of garden, where she had once cultivated healing herbs, was trampled. She was denied the fundamental necessities of life by a community gripped by fear and suspicion. The informal sanctions of a medieval village could be as devastating as any formal judgment. Mabel retreated further into her crumbling cottage, her isolation complete. The cold seeped into her bones, and hunger gnawed at her insides. She was old, alone, and utterly powerless against the tide of collective fear and hatred. Her knowledge, her simple life, had become a terrifying weapon in the eyes of her neighbors, and her poverty, far from evoking pity, only made her seem more dangerous, more susceptible to dark forces. She was a living embodiment of the medieval belief that misfortune was often caused by malevolent forces, and that the vulnerable, particularly old women, were often the conduits for such evil. She had lived her entire life in this land, had watched generations come and go, had seen the fens change with the seasons. Now, the very earth seemed to turn against her. Her final days were spent in a terrifying silence, broken only by the gnawing emptiness in her stomach and the relentless cold. She was not put to the stake, not hanged, but quietly, slowly, starved and frozen out by the very community she had once served. Her final breath taken in a place that had become her prison, a victim of ignorance, fear, and the cruel indifference that disguised itself as righteousness. Her story, repeated in countless variations across medieval Europe, spoke of the terrible fate of the elderly who fell outside the protective bounds of family and community, particularly when superstition took root. Number 1. The elder beggar at the city gates. Julian had once known the inside of a warm, bustling baker's shop, his hands kneading dough, his nose familiar with the sweet scent of rising bread. For many years he had been a respected craftsman in a small market town, producing loaves that fed families and contributed to the rhythm of daily life. He was a freeman, not bound to any lord, his skill his own. But a fire, an unpredictable and devastating scourge in medieval towns, had consumed his shop, his home, and his livelihood in a single night. Accounts of medieval urban fires, such as those recorded in city chronicles, often detail the widespread destruction and loss of life and property. Too old to rebuild, too weary to start again, Julian had nothing left but the clothes on his back and the slow, inevitable creep of age. He had walked for days, his worn boots kicking up dust on the rutted roads, his stomach a hollow ache. He arrived at the imposing gates of a major city, perhaps London or Paris, a sprawling labyrinth of timber-framed houses, narrow lanes, and constant noise. He joined the silent multitude of the destitute who congregated there, a permanent fixture of medieval urban life. The city gates were often places where the rich entered and the poor gathered, a stark visual representation of medieval social stratification. Illustrations from medieval manuscripts, such as those in the Livre de la Chasse or Chronicles of Paris, often show beggars at city entrances. Julian was now a beggar, one of the countless poor of Christ, who relied on the intermittent charity of passers-by. His days were a monotonous cycle of standing, waiting, extending a trembling hand, whispering pleas for alms. His voice, once strong enough to call out prices, was now a hoarse whisper. His body, once robust from manual labor, was now emaciated, his bones protruding beneath his threadbare tunic. He lived by the unspoken rules of the streets, finding a spot, defending it, learning who might be generous and who would simply spit in contempt. Charity in medieval towns was primarily administered through the church. Individual acts of piety or specific charitable foundations. Mendicant orders, like the Franciscans and Dominicans, were founded partly to minister to the urban poor and beggars. However, the sheer number of impoverished people in large cities far outstripped the available alms. Ecclesiastical records and sermons often exhorted the faithful to give to the poor, but the reality of daily provision was far more challenging. City ordinances sometimes attempted to regulate begging, distinguishing between the deserving poor, the truly infirm or disabled, and the undeserving poor, those deemed able to work, but choosing not to. Julian, with his visible infirmity, was perhaps considered deserving, but this offered little practical advantage when charity was so scarce. Julian's greatest enemies were the cold of winter and the hunger that gnawed at his insides. Medieval winters were often harsh and lacking proper shelter or warm clothing. Many elderly beggars perished from exposure. Chronicles and death records from medieval hospitals often reveal a spike in deaths during the colder months. He slept wherever he could find a sheltered corner, beneath an overhang, in a deserted alleyway. Or sometimes, if he was lucky, in the corner of a stable, sharing the meager warmth of animals. Each morning was a triumph of survival. He saw others like him, old men and women, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow, their bodies ravaged by age and hunger. They rarely spoke, a silent brotherhood of the forgotten. They were the flotsam of a society that had no systemic way to care for its aging, unproductive members. There were no municipal poorhouses of the scale that would emerge later. No state welfare. A person's survival depended entirely on their ability to work, their family network, or the unpredictable generosity of strangers. Julian had lost the first two and found the third to be insufficient. The city, with its towering cathedrals and bustling markets, its wealthy merchants and powerful guilds, seemed indifferent to their plight. Its very grandeur highlighted the depth of their misery. Wealthy citizens passing by in their fine clothes might occasionally toss a coin, an act of piety perhaps, but rarely an act of genuine concern. Sumptuary laws, which dictated clothing based on social status, meant that Julian's rags were not just a mark of poverty, but a symbol of his place at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. He remembered the taste of his own fresh bread, crusty and warm, pulled from the oven. Now a crust of stale bread, sometimes salvaged from a rubbish heap, was a luxury. He remembered the comforting smell of yeast. Now the overwhelming smell was that of human waste, rotting refuse, and the damp earth. His memories, once a source of quiet comfort, now served only to emphasize the profound loss he had experienced. Julian often thought of the warmth of the baker's oven, a distant memory that mocked the perpetual cold that permeated his bones. He was a silent witness to the cruel paradox of medieval life, a society capable of building magnificent monuments to God and great halls for its rulers, yet unable to offer more than a desperate pittance to its elderly who had outlived their usefulness. His existence at the city gates was not just a personal tragedy, but a stark, undeniable testament to the widespread, brutal reality of elderly poverty in a world without formal compassion for those who could no longer contribute. His slow, agonizing end was not just the end of a single life, but a recurring, forgotten footnote in the grand, often brutal narrative of the medieval age.